Hello, and welcome to another episode of the BeamG podcast. Today we're going to talk in general terms about the craft of storytelling. So, much of the craft behind fabulation has to do with structuring the story being told, as we've seen in a couple of other episodes. And that means the organization of the narrative. Many authors design the narrative first, before filling the first page with text, but not all of them do. The process of planning how the story works is known as outlining, and not all authors do that. But there are significant benefits to outlining, as we will see. For one thing, going through this process usually entails fewer rewrites later. When the author knows the direction of the overall storyline, it's easier to keep all its threads under control while writing. Without this direction, there's a danger of losing the plot halfway through. Given that stories have structure, you can break story down into component parts. Now, we'll try to help you become conscious of structure as we go on, episode by episode, because understanding structure will help you organize stories. And with that, we don't just mean plot. We also mean developing the characters. Creating a solid structure for your story helps you turn your story into an emotional and, as they say, visceral experience for the audience. If a story works, the recipient, the audience or reader, experiences the story as just that, an experience, meaning that a story is successful when perceived and processed emotionally as well as intellectually. Or, as it's sometimes described, a good story is visceral. At best, the recipient will have been changed just a little bit by that experience, because experience entails learning. It all starts with character building. Stories have characters, all of them do. Authors devise characters just as they devise plots. Often the act of devising a story cannot be easily separated into thinking up a plot and thinking up characters. Indeed, why would any author want to? As we've said before, characters arise out of plot ideas as much as plot ideas arise out of characters. For a character to function well within a story, he or she, or it, must exhibit certain properties or aspects. We're not talking about height or hair color here. These might be interesting, but they are, structurally speaking, mostly irrelevant to the story. Far more essential to the development of the story are aspects such as each character's motivations. That means problems, want, goal, needs, etc. And the obstacles that he or she must overcome. So we're going to try to help authors find and hone and sharpen the essential aspects of characters, because by doing so the author will, at the same time, hone and sharpen the plot. But what about language? Well, of course, every story is told. It therefore has language, text, if the medium is story as presented in a book. Film has its own language too, so does theatre. Language is one of the most important components of story, of course. By language, we don't just mean English or German or Korean, not just the text, be it prose or poetry. We mean the language of the medium. For example, the language of film involves moving pictures and sound. More specifically, involves lighting, production design, sound engineering, camera operation, etc., etc., etc. So the language of prose or poetry involves text, which means dealing with grammar, orthography, syntax, semantics, etc., etc. We're not going to be talking about any of that, really. This whole podcast is not about language. But what we can help you with is storytelling. dramaturgy, structure. So, apart from language, stories have plots and characters. Creating plots and characters is a craft. A craft is learnable. That's what we're going to be concentrating on. So, yes, this podcast accompanies our story development tool available on beamg.com. And beamg.com is an outlining and character development tool, and it's easy to use, so easy to use, hopefully, that anyone can create emotionally engaging stories. But enough of the advertising. What about meaning? Well, the meaning of a story has its basis in the story, in the sense that the story is a vehicle for meaning. So to a great extent, it's through the execution, through the language, that meaning is mostly conveyed. Whatever level of meaning an author is interested in, be it allegory or parable or symbolism, psychology, the truth of the human condition, or just a ripping good yarn, it has at its core a story. The most deep and meaningful stories ever, whether for you these are like by James Joyce or William Faulkner or Homer or Musil, or as recounted in Three Kingdoms or Shahnameh, or not to mention such holy texts as Mahabharata or Ramayana or the Bible, the Torah or the Quran. These all describe events, so plot, and people, so characters. So we can't really help you create meaning, but we may be able to help you communicate meaning. Techniques and structural devices exist to make meaning clear to the audience or reader, and we'll point them out, and without ever being prescriptive. We'll talk about meaning in another episode in greater depth. Ultimately, the more effective the story, the more likely the recipient is to glean meaning out of it. And with that, we don't solely mean the author's intention, but also the interpretation and understanding each individual recipient brings to bear on your story.